Picture this: a king in crimson and gold, certain his throne is unshakable. His word is law. His crown gleams with divine authority. And yet, one summer in 1215, that crown trembled, not from armies, but from the scratch of quills and the press of wax upon parchment. The Magna Carta. Today, it's hailed as liberty's birth certificate. But here's the truth. In 1215, it was no triumph. It was a desperate truce, signed by a cornered king in a realm on the edge of civil war. And here's the twist. Within weeks, it collapsed, torn apart, annulled, condemned as shameful and demeaning by the Pope. So how did a failed truce, annulled within weeks, become the foundation of freedom across centuries? The year was 1215. England was a realm caught between majesty and misery. On one side, the glory of the medieval world towered high. Cathedrals stretched toward the heavens, their stone spires symbols of faith and ambition. Monastic libraries housed precious manuscripts, while royal courts displayed jewels, silks, and gold plate, reminders of a society that believed in divine order and earthly splendor. But just beyond the cathedral doors, life was starkly different. In the muddy villages that dotted the countryside, peasants bent their backs to the plow, tethered by the obligations of feudal law. Most would never travel more than a few miles from their birthplace. Hunger, illness, and hard labor were constants. Their lives were bound by the seasons and by the demands of their lords. This was feudal England, a society structured like a great chain. At the very top stood the king, whose crown symbolized not only earthly authority, but divine will. Beneath him, the barons and lords, men who commanded castles, private armies, and swathes of land. Below them, knights and clergy, who served either with sword or sermon. And at the base, the mass of common folk, who carried the burden that held the system together. It was a system that had endured for generations, balanced on loyalty and obligation. But under King John, that balance was breaking apart, fractured by greed, betrayal, and a hunger for power that knew no limits. John's path to the throne was as unlikely as it was fateful. Born in 1166, he was the youngest son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His older brothers, Henry the Young King, Geoffrey of Brittany, and Richard the Lionheart, were destined for crowns, lands, and glory. John was not. He was mocked as John Lackland because, in the cruel jest of his family, he would inherit nothing. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The young king died in rebellion against their father. Geoffrey perished in a tournament, and Richard, celebrated across Europe as the warrior king of the Crusades, met an untimely death from a crossbow wound in 1199. One by one, the path cleared until the crown that had once seemed impossibly far fell onto John's brow. Yet the crown could not erase John's character. Where Richard was bold, John was cautious. Where Richard inspired loyalty, John bred suspicion. Chroniclers described him as mercurial, quick to anger, easily wounded in pride, and ruthless in revenge. He was intelligent, yes, but cunning in a way that served his own interest above all else. And unlike Richard, who spent much of his reign abroad fighting wars, John ruled at home. That meant the nobles and barons of England experienced his personality firsthand, day after day. They did not forget what they saw. The first shadow over John's reign was cast not in England but across the Channel. For generations, English kings had ruled vast territories in France. Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine. These lands were not just possessions, they were the backbone of the Plantagenet dynasty's power. But John, through poor judgment and political blunders, began to lose them. In 1204, disaster struck. Normandy, the jewel of the crown's French holdings, fell to King Philip II of France. For a dynasty that had prided itself on ruling more of France than the French king himself, this was a humiliation of staggering proportions. Nobles who had sworn loyalty to John saw their lands confiscated or overrun. The prestige of the English crown crumbled. Desperate to restore his honor and reclaim his lands, John poured money into war. He hired mercenaries, raised armies, and launched campaign after campaign. But his efforts ended not in triumph, but in defeat. The final blow came in 1214 at the Battle of Bouvines. John had built a coalition of allies against Philip II, but on the battlefield, that alliance collapsed. His forces were routed, and the dream of regaining Normandy vanished forever. The cost of these failures was not just military, it was financial. Wars were expensive, and John had bled the treasury dry. With no more victories to show, he turned to the only resource left, his kingdom itself, and he squeezed it mercilessly, igniting the anger that would soon engulf his reign. Taxes were not new to medieval England. Every king demanded money from his subjects, but under John, taxation became suffocating. He leaned heavily on scutage, a fee barons could pay to avoid sending knights to war. Once an occasional levy, John demanded it again and again, each time at higher rates. Imagine paying the same service fee over and over, even when no service was rendered. He fined nobles for the smallest infractions, sometimes invented out of thin air. He bled wealthy widows by charging them immense sums to remain unmarried or to choose their next husband. He sold justice itself, turning the royal courts into a marketplace where verdicts went to the highest bidder. His sheriffs scoured villages and towns, squeezing common folk with arbitrary tolls, levies, and fees. Merchants who tried to trade found themselves caught in a web of extortion. Even freemen could not rely on their rights unless they paid the crown for the privilege. This was not taxation as we think of it today, debated in legislatures, distributed through budgets, and at least theoretically tied to the common good. John's taxes were personal extractions, designed to enrich the king, not serve the realm. His officials were not guardians of law, but predators. And everywhere, resentment boiled, among peasants, merchants, knights, and, most dangerously, the barons who had once been the foundation of his rule. Not even the church, the most powerful institution of the medieval world, was safe from John's tyranny. In 1205, the Archbishop of Canterbury died, sparking a bitter dispute over his successor. John rejected Pope Innocent III's choice, Stephen Langton, a learned and respected cleric. John wanted his own man in the seat, a loyal servant of the crown. The Pope responded with fury. In 1208, he placed England under interdict. Churches closed their doors, bells no longer tolled. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, all the sacred rituals of daily life were suspended. For ordinary people, it was as though heaven itself had turned its back on England. Then came excommunication. John himself was cast out of the church, his soul, according to medieval belief, barred from salvation. His legitimacy as a king teetered on the edge of collapse. Although John eventually capitulated and reconciled with Rome, the damage was done. He had shown himself willing to defy not only his nobles, but God's own representative on earth. To his subjects, this was proof of arrogance beyond forgiveness. By 1215, the kingdom was a powder keg. The barons had endured years of taxation, humiliation, and failed wars. They had given John men, money, and loyalty, and in return, he had delivered nothing but loss. His reputation as a cruel, faithless ruler spread like wildfire. That spring, a group of powerful barons made their move. They renounced their loyalty to the king and raised their banners in open defiance. With armed forces at their backs, they marched on London. When the capital fell into their hands, the balance of power shifted. John was cornered. For perhaps the first time in his reign, he had no choice but to listen. The barons demanded a settlement, a charter of liberties that would bind the king himself to the law. And so, the stage was set for a meeting that would echo through history, the gathering at Runnymede. It was June 15th, 1215. The sun beat down on a broad meadow beside the River Thames, near a place called Runnymede. Here, in this quiet landscape, history held its breath. On one side stood King John, still crowned, still robed in royal authority, but diminished, his confidence shaken. On the other side, the rebel barons, armored knights at their flanks, their banners fluttering in the summer wind. The air was thick with tension. Every gesture, every word carried the weight of war or peace. The swords at the knights' sides glinted in the light, silent reminders that if this meeting failed, blood would surely flow. John was not a man accustomed to bending, yet here, surrounded and outnumbered, he had little choice but to yield. What emerged from that standoff was a document unlike any other. It was called the Magna Carta, Latin for Great Charter. This was no fiery declaration of liberty, no grand philosophical statement. It was a list, 63 clauses, written in the dry, meticulous Latin of lawyers and scribes. Yet behind those words lay revolution. Some clauses were practical, addressing grievances of the day, trade regulations, fishing rights, the privileges of London merchants, but others reached deeper, striking at the very heart of monarchy itself. On June 15, 1215, King John pressed his royal seal onto parchment. The Magna Carta was born. Among its 63 clauses were promises that no free man could be imprisoned without trial, that justice could not be sold or delayed, and that even the king himself was bound by law. It was a fragile victory, won in a meadow under the threat of rebellion. But it planted a seed that would grow far beyond what anyone at Runnymede could have imagined. This moment at Runnymede is a turning point history never forgets. If you're enjoying this journey, tap subscribe. We uncover these crossroads of history all the time. Because what came next would test whether this fragile charter could survive or vanish into obscurity. Though John sealed the Magna Carta with his royal hand, in his heart he seethed with rage. He saw it not as a treaty, but as humiliation. Almost at once, he turned to his ally, the Pope. John declared that he had signed under duress, forced by traitors. Pope Innocent III agreed, issuing a papal bull that annulled the charter. He called it shameful, demeaning, and illegal, unfit for a king to uphold. John felt vindicated, but his defiance came at a price. The barons exploded with fury. To them, the annulment was betrayal. Their fragile trust in the king dissolved overnight. War erupted. England was plunged into the First Barons' War, a brutal conflict of sieges, raids, and shifting alliances. In desperation, the barons even invited Prince Louis of France to cross the Channel and claim the English throne. John fought back fiercely, rallying his forces, burning towns, crushing resistance where he could. But the tide of history had turned against him. In October 1216, John's reign came to an abrupt end. While campaigning in the east of England, he fell ill, some say from dysentery, others whispered of poison. Whatever the cause, the once mighty king withered quickly. He died at Newark Castle, leaving his 9-year-old son Henry as his heir. The most hated monarch in England's history was gone, but the story of Magna Carta was only beginning. With John dead, the kingdom teetered on the brink. The young Henry III needed the loyalty of the barons to survive. His regents knew the answer. They reissued the Magna Carta. This time, it was not a humiliation. It was a gesture of reconciliation, a promise that the crown would honor the liberties of its people. Over the following decades, the charter was revised, reissued, and reaffirmed. What began as a failed peace treaty became enshrined in English law, a cornerstone of governance that no king could entirely erase. The Magna Carta was, in its own time, a failure. Within weeks of being sealed at Runnymede, Pope Innocent III annulled it at King John's request. To the Pope, it was an insult to royal authority, a dangerous precedent of subjects dictating terms to their sovereign. To John, it was nothing more than a piece of parchment forced upon him at sword point. Yet history often works in strange ways. Though the charter collapsed as a peace treaty, its words took on a life of their own. The ink faded, but the idea endured. By the mid-13th century, kings who thought themselves above the law found the Magna Carta thrown back in their faces. It was reissued again and again, sometimes voluntarily by monarchs who sought to win support, sometimes demanded by barons who refused to yield. Each reissue gave it more legitimacy. Each invocation planted the notion deeper that the king could be held accountable. It was no longer just a legal document. It was becoming something far more powerful, a symbol of resistance, of rights, of the enduring belief that no ruler, however mighty, stood above the law. As England matured, so too did the Magna Carta's influence. The 13th and 14th centuries saw the steady rise of Parliament, an institution that would gradually limit royal authority. When kings sought extraordinary taxes, Parliament pointed to the Magna Carta, insisting that such levies required consent. In the courts of law, judges began to echo its principles. The Charter's guarantee that no free man could be imprisoned without lawful judgment evolved into the cornerstone of English common law. Trial by jury, due process, and habeas corpus, the right to challenge unlawful detention, all trace their ancestry to clauses inked in that meadow beside the Thames. Even monarchs who despised the Charter could not entirely escape it. In moments of crisis, rebels wielded it like a weapon. During the reign of Edward I, Edward III, and beyond, the Magna Carta was cited as the ancient safeguard of liberty. By the 17th century, when Charles I clashed with Parliament in the English Civil War, Magna Carta was raised once more, presented as evidence that even kings must bow before the rule of law. For every attempt to bury it, the Great Charter rose stronger. What had begun as a reluctant concession by a reluctant king had transformed into a rallying cry for centuries of reform. Centuries later, English colonists carried not only their language and customs across the Atlantic Ocean, but also the principles of Magna Carta. When disputes with the crown grew sharper in the 18th century, American patriots reached back across the centuries to claim the Charter as their inheritance. They declared that the rights of Englishmen extended to them as well, and that a king who taxed them without their consent violated the spirit of Runnymede. No taxation without representation was not an invention of 1776. It was the echo of demands first uttered by barons in 1215. The framers of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights knew this history well. The Fifth Amendment's guarantee of due process, the Sixth Amendment's right to a fair trial, and the writ of habeas corpus enshrined in the Constitution all carry the unmistakable fingerprints of Magna Carta. For Americans, the Great Charter was not an English relic, but a universal principle. It was proof that liberty was not granted by rulers, but claimed by the people and protected by law. But the Magna Carta's influence didn't stop at America's shores. Its echoes would spread across the world. The influence of Magna Carta did not stop at the shores of England or the founding halls of America. Its reach is global. In the 19th and 20th centuries, reformers and revolutionaries alike invoked its spirit. Campaigners for democracy in Europe pointed to its example. Advocates for civil rights in Asia, Africa, and Latin America claimed it as part of the universal heritage of freedom. When the United Nations drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, echoes of Magna Carta were unmistakable. Equality before the law, protection against arbitrary imprisonment, and the recognition that rights belong not to rulers, but to all humankind. Today, fragments of the original parchment are preserved under glass, their Latin words weathered by centuries. Yet those words have crossed oceans, toppled tyrants, and shaped constitutions. They have inspired presidents, prime ministers, judges, and ordinary citizens alike. What began in a tense meadow by the Thames in 1215, a failed peace agreement between a desperate king and angry barons, has become one of humanity's most enduring testaments to liberty. It is the reminder that law is stronger than power, that justice is stronger than fear, and that the voice of the people once raised can echo across the ages. The Magna Carta began as little more than a desperate truce between a troubled king and his rebellious nobles. By every measure of its time, it failed. It was annulled within weeks, ignored by John, and nearly lost to history. And yet, it survived. Why? Because parchment and ink may be fragile, but ideas are not. The clauses of Magna Carta, some concerned with fish weirs, others with feudal rights, were not revolutionary in their own moment. Yet hidden within its dry legal phrases were principles that refused to die. That law must be higher than any ruler, that justice cannot be bought or denied, that freedom cannot exist without accountability. Over centuries, those principles grew. They outlived dynasties, wars, revolutions, and empires. They crossed oceans with colonists, were shouted from the steps of Parliament, and echoed in the declarations of new nations. They inspired the cry of revolutionaries, the arguments of lawyers, and the hopes of citizens who believed that power must always be restrained by law. The Magna Carta reminds us of a profound truth. Liberty is rarely born in triumph. More often, it begins in struggle, compromise, and failure. What matters is that the flame, once lit, is carried forward. Think of that meadow at Runnymede. A frightened king, surrounded by enemies, pressed his seal into wax. He thought he was saving his throne. In reality, he was surrendering something far greater, the idea that kings themselves could be bound. That moment changed the trajectory of history. And though the men who stood there could never have imagined it, their charter would one day shape the lives of billions. The day a king lost control was the day liberty took root. And it's a reminder, words outlast crowns. Always. And it's a reminder to us all, words, once spoken, once written, once claimed, can outlive any throne, any crown, any king. If you've been moved by this journey through the shadowed halls of history, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because there are countless more stories of power, betrayal, mystery, and freedom waiting to be uncovered. And the next one may just change the way you see the world forever.